The following presentation discusses the Stamp Act of 1765, examining the law itself and its impact on the American colonies. In 1765, the dust is still settling from the recent 7 Years' War, a conflict that is known as the French and Indian War in America. Britain is the victor, and her realm is now global in scale. We will zoom in to North America. Britain is now the unmatched power in North America east of the Mississippi River. However, the long war was costly, and the empire needs revenue to repay its national debt. Following the long war against France, Britain had accumulated a £140 million debt, which included an annual interest sum of £5 million each year. £140 million in 1765 is the equivalent of about £20 billion in 2023. So from an administrative perspective, London feels a very urgent need to raise revenue. In 1765, George III is the king, but George Grenville is the prime minister. It's important to remember that taxation comes from Parliament, not the king. Grenville believed that it was logical for Americans to pay for the British soldiers who were protecting America's frontier. Britain had a history of raising revenues on the British Islands through stamp duties. It was logical to Grenville that Parliament should extend a stamp duty to America. It's called a stamp duty because a stamp was embossed onto a paper or vellum sheet, indicating that the appropriate tax had been paid for that document. This 1755 pine tree stamp document from Massachusetts shows that colonial governments employed this style of taxation as well. Now, Grenville wanted a Stamp Act created for the whole of the American colonies. The task of composing the Stamp Act went to Grenville's Treasury Secretary, Thomas Whately. Whately consults prominent American officials, including John Temple in Boston and Jared Ingersoll in Connecticut, about the feasibility of a stamp tax in America. But Temple and Ingersoll, both committed British agents, advised against such an act. However, Whately pressed forward and prepared a draft for the Stamp Act in December 1764. In February 1765, the Stamp Act moves to Parliament for deliberations. In the House of Commons, an argument is stirring within Parliament over the appropriateness of London's role in taxing the colonies directly. The Stamp Act was different from other taxes that Parliament had placed on our American colonies. Previous taxes were considered indirect taxes because they were paid by merchants who imported goods from Britain. The merchants, in turn, recouped their expenses by raising the price on the wares sold to customers. For instance, Americans who had purchased sugar that had been imported from the Caribbean were not directly taxed by Parliament. The merchant importing the molasses was taxed. American consumers might end up indirectly paying the merchant a higher price for these wares, but it was the merchant, not the consumer, who was taxed by Parliament. These sorts of indirect taxes on the colonies had been common since Charles II's Restoration era in the 1660s. During the Restoration era, the King and Parliament wanted to re-establish more direct connection with their colonies following the turmoil of the English Civil War period. So American colonists had been paying indirect custom duties for 100 years by the 1760s. However, the Stamp Act was different from previous taxes. Parliament was now imposing a direct tax on colonists. While stamp taxes existed in the British Isles, the American colonists had never been so directly taxed by Parliament. American colonists did pay taxes that were levied by their colonial assemblies. Americans were long accustomed to paying taxes to their colonial governments. They were not accustomed to paying taxes to London. There were some in Parliament who understood and respected this distinction. In February 1765, these concerns were voiced in the House of Commons. However, Charles Townshend, who would later author the Townshend Acts, argues that Parliament had every authority to impose taxes like the Stamp Act on the colonies, especially if the Americans were going to rely on His Majesty's troops for protection. In opposition is Isaac Barre, who served in America during the French and Indian War. Barre gave Parliament fair warning regarding the colonists' vigilance toward their rights and liberties. Barre stated, "The people, I believe, are as truly loyal as any subjects the king has, but a people jealous of their liberties and who will vindicate them if ever they should be violated, but the subject is too delicate and I will say no more." Barre describes the Americans who oppose taxation as the sons of liberty. Grenville is now engaged in a test of wills. From his perspective, Parliament is supreme authority in the British Empire. The colonies had no right to challenge the supremacy of Parliament. Grenville will remain deaf to the protests that swell in the colonies, or to the political reality that 3 million Americans might have the power to stand up to Parliament. Most of Parliament in early 1765 thought Grenville's Stamp Act was logical. The House of Commons approved the Stamp Act, with 245 members voting yes and 49 members voting no. The bill then moved from the House of Commons to the House of Lords in March 1765, where it was passed into law. The Stamp Act was thus passed by Parliament in March 1765. The Stamp Act was to come into effect on November 1st, 1765. The wording of the Stamp Act is quite comprehensive, detailing the scope and wide-ranging itemization of the materials to be taxed. The Stamp Act opens with a summary justifying the legislation. It begins, "Whereas by an act made in the last session of Parliament, several duties were granted, continued, and appropriated toward defraying the expenses of defending, protecting, and securing the British colonies and plantations in America. And whereas it is just and necessary that provision be made for raising a further revenue within your Majesty's dominions in America towards defraying the said expenses, we, your Majesty's most dutiful and loyal subjects, and Commons of Great Britain and Parliament assembled, have therefore resolved to give and grant unto your Majesty the several rates and duties hereinafter mentioned." The stipulations are quite exact. The first stipulation reads, "For every skin or piece of vellum or parchment, or sheet or piece of paper, on which shall be engrossed, written, or printed, any declaration, plea, replication, rejoinder, demurrer, or other pleading, or any copy thereof, in any court of law within the British colonies and plantations in America, a stamp duty of 3 pence. The Stamp Act included all manner of materials appearing on paper, including court bail documents, wills, court judgments, licenses, bond payment letters, mortgages, and other documents. The tax rate varied depending on the type of document. For reference, £1 in 1765 would be about 143 UK pounds in 2023. So £1 is a significant amount of money in 1765. £10 in the 1760s would be over 1,400 UK pounds in 2023. Shillings are fractions of pounds, and thus much smaller sums. 1 shilling in 1765 would be about 5 UK pounds today. The Stamp Act was very precise. Business licenses require a duty. A license for the retailing of wine had a high duty of £4. Surveying warrants were taxed. A warrant for surveying land between 100 and 200 acres required a stamp duty of 1 shilling. But a warrant for surveying land between 200 and 320 acres required a stamp duty of 1 shilling and 6 pence. George Washington was a surveyor. All legal documents required a stamp. Any court judgment or sentence required a stamp duty of 4 shillings. Any bail notice was subject to a 2 shilling duty. John Adams was an attorney. Printers were also hit with duties. A duty for 2 shillings was owed for every advertisement that appeared in a gazette or newspaper. The Pennsylvania Journal and Weekly Advertiser shown here is from Halloween Day, 1756, the day before the Stamp Act takes effect. The paper is outlined like a tombstone with a skull and crossbones at center. On the upper right is another skull and crossbones indicating where a stamp will be needed to be affixed. Below it reads, "Expiring in hopes of a resurrection to life again." Every almanac and calendar was subject to a 4-pence duty. Multi-page pamphlets were to be registered with the colonial distributor so that the proper accounting could be made of the duties necessary for publication. Benjamin Franklin was a printer. Even playing cards are included in the paper items to be taxed. The Stamp Act reads, "And for and upon every pack of playing cards and all dice, which shall be sold or used within the said colonies and plantations, the several stamp duties following, that is to say, for every pack of such cards the sum of 1 shilling, for every pair of such dice the sum of 10 shillings. The Stamp Act covered all the American colonies, including the newly conquered Canadian colonies. The Act explicitly mandates that stamp duties in the French-speaking portions of Canada cannot exceed the equivalent duties in English-speaking America. Thus, Parliament was enacting the stamp duties fairly between the English and French-speaking realms within the American colonies. There are exceptions to the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act did not extend to documents made between colonial governments and Native American nations. Documents of prayer, certain assembly paper documents, and common school books were all exempt from the duty. The Act includes logistical details. In the case of books like almanacs, only one of the sheets needed an actual stamp, and the full duty for the volume would then be calculated. An interesting religious accommodation is provided in the Stamp Act. The language of the Act requires oaths. However, Quakers had resisted taking oaths due to Christ's command to not swear oaths. Within the language of the Stamp Act, when an oath is required before a justice or magistrate, Quakers are permitted to make a solemn affirmation instead. The massive scale of the Stamp Act required significant manpower to enforce. The Stamp Act provided for this necessity. Officers would be appointed to courts and public offices. The officers made the following oath. I do swear that I will faithfully execute the trust reposed in me, pursuant to the Act of Parliament made in the 5th year of the reign of His Majesty King George III, for granting certain stamp duties and other duties in the British colonies and plantations in America without fraud or concealment, and will from time to time true account make of my doing therein, and deliver the same to such person or persons as His Majesty, his heirs or successors, shall appoint to receive such account, and will make no fee, reward, or profit for the execution or performance of the said trust, or the business related thereto from any person or persons, other than such as shall be allowed by His Majesty his heirs and successors, or by some other person or persons under him or them to that purpose authorized. The Stamp Act provided penalties for those foregoing or attempting to bypass the law. Unstamped papers had no legal merit and were inadmissible to courts. Using unstamped papers or cutting out a stamp from one sheet to use on another would pay a penalty of £50 for every offense. £50 in 1765 is the equivalent to over £7,000 in 2023 currency. So these penalties would be absolutely crushing if a single stack of papers had been illicitly used. In the case of the sale of unregistered pamphlets, the authors, printer, publisher, and any other person in employment of the publication would each pay £10 for every offense, a sum that would easily crush a printing house. The penalty for offending newspapers rose to £20 for all persons involved for each offense. Forging or counterfeiting stamps might be considered a felony, and the penalty could be death without the benefit of clergy. The Stamp Act reads, "And it is hereby declared that upon any prosecution or prosecutions for such felony, the die, tool, or other instrument made use of in counterfeiting or forging any such seal, stamp, mark, type, device, or label, together with the vellum, having such counterfeit impression, shall, immediately after the trial or conviction of the party or parties accused, be broke, defaced, or destroyed in open court." Duties for educational degrees show a curious distinction between taxation rates in America as compared to taxation on the British Isles. The Stamp Act calls for a duty of £2 on university degree papers, the equivalent of 285 UK pounds in 2023. But university degrees in England had a stamp tax of only 2 shillings, the equivalent of about 10 UK pounds in 2023, a substantially lower rate than required in America. The Stamp Act was passed in March 1765, but it would not come into effect until November the 1st. Parliament still had to work out the certain logistics of the operation. Essentially, Stamp Act revenues would be collected by the stamp distributors. The deputy postmaster would in turn apply these revenues to pay the redcoats protecting America's borders. From the perspective in London, most parliamentarians saw no issue with the Stamp Act when it went through both houses in early 1765. After all, the British Isles had a long tradition of such taxes. They seemed straightforward and effective. However, American colonists in 1765 saw an important distinction between this new Stamp Act and the previous taxes they had paid for generations. First, lawyers, newspaper printers, merchants, statesmen, and other educated classes used paper documents regularly. Parliament had essentially put a tax on people with means. In essence, professional educated men of means in America now had a common foe, Parliament way over there across the ocean. There was another cause for concern among these professionals beyond paying duties. Newspaper printers, for instance, had their materials examined by stamp officers. If a newspaper printer or politician angered these agents, it was conceivable that the agents could refuse to issue the stamps. So it was a possibility that certain ideas could essentially be censored. In 1765, there is a major philosophical difference in the concept of representation on the opposite side of the Atlantic. In Britain, it was assumed that each member of Parliament represented the interests of every citizen in the whole realm. However, American colonists believed that representation required a statesman appointed from each and every geographic area. Americans increasingly believed that they were properly represented in their colonial assemblies. Parliament was a distant agency removed from their interests. But Americans have some allies in Parliament. Grenville's greatest opponent in Parliament over the taxation of the American colonies will be his brother-in-law, William Pitt. William Pitt and some other parliamentarians appreciate the distinction that Americans make between paying taxes to colonial assemblies as opposed to Parliament. And a stamp tax by Parliament on the colonies was going to strike a nerve. What's unique about a stamp tax is that it essentially taxes every life stage. All life events that include a paper document are taxed. Thus, birth is taxed because one needs a stamp on the birth certificate. School records are taxed as one acquires a degree. The attainment of a profession or trade is taxed because one needs a proper license. Marriage is taxed because one receives a license for that as well. Even death is taxed, as that event necessitates a paper record. The ramifications from the Stamp Act are immediate. March 1765. The Stamp Act has successfully cleared the House of Commons and the House of Lords in Parliament. The new law is set to commence November 1st. May 1765. In Williamsburg, Virginia, a member of the House of Burgesses is courting revolution. Patrick Henry has proposed resolutions to refuse both the Stamp Act and any further attempt by Parliament to tax the colonies. These Virginia resolutions pass. The summer of 1765 is a summer of widespread protest in the colonies, and London is realizing the fury rising from their colonies. The Stamp Act was not even in effect yet, but the spirit of resistance was in the streets. Americans drove stamp officers from their homes months before these officers were able to collect a single duty. July 1765. In London, Grenville is replaced by Charles Watson Wentworth, Marquis of Rockingham. October 1765. It's 1 month before the Stamp Act takes effect. Delegates from 9 colonies meet in New York City. The Stamp Act Congress consents to the traditional customs duties at the ports, but Congress opposes direct taxes like the Stamp Act. The colonies are now working together to oppose Parliament's authority. By now, the ships bearing the stamps are arriving in American ports. The Commonwealth of Virginia has already declared the stamps void. In Charleston, the stamps are destroyed by the Sons of Liberty. November 1765. The Stamp Act is now supposed to be in effect. However, with ships turned away at ports, stamps confiscated or destroyed, and officers intimidated to enforce the law, the Stamp Act is entirely unenforceable. By law, paper must be stamped to have any legal bearing, but papers are not being stamped. Business shuts down. Courthouses can't issue deeds, judgments, or sentences. Government shuts down. December 1765. It's 1 month after the ineffectual start of the Stamp Act. Millions of pounds of bills and business transactions come to a halt. Merchants, businessmen, and stockholders in Britain feel the crunch of the American protest. British merchants are now opposing the act. Parliament is now hearing from business interests at home. January 1766. In Parliament, William Pitt sides with the colonists in denouncing the Stamp Act. March 1766. 1 year after the Stamp Act's passage, it is repealed by Parliament. It had been in effect for only a few months, and it was a total failure. However, Parliament also passes the Declaratory Act, which declares Parliament as the supreme authority in the British Empire. The immediate issue of the Stamp Act is resolved. However, the larger philosophical issue concerning the power balance between Parliament and the colonial assemblies is still at issue.